What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. Later on today, of course, on Max, will be the 5th episode of the 2nd season of Winning Time. And of course, that series focuses on the Showtime Lakers. And from time to time, they sort of touch on the Magic versus Bird rivalry. And of course, it was Magic and Bird that saved the NBA from what appeared to be an early demise. Having said that, we cannot forget that it was Dr. J that was keeping the league afloat while Magic and Larry were both in high school and or college. It was Dr. J was keeping the league afloat. Maybe not thriving, but at least having a pulse until Magic and Larry came and did what they did. But another thing that gets lost in history is the fact that Dr. J and Dr. J and Larry Bird had their own rivalry. As a matter of fact, you could make an argument that the rivalry between the Philadelphia 76ers and Boston Celtics was even more intense than the one between Boston and the Lakers. They both were in the same conference, and not only were they in the same conference, I believe, at the time at least, they were in the same division. Let's see something here. 1980. I think they're in the same division. Check something out here. Yep, they're both in the Atlantic Division. And I don't know, I sometimes forget whether they switch up teams from time to time and put them in different divisions. So I'm so used to looking at conferences and not divisions anymore. But I thought they were in the same division. Yeah, they were in the same division, which means that they played against each other far more often than, say, Boston played LA. And remember, back in those days, there were just 23 teams in 1980 as opposed to 30 now. So that means that they played against each other more often. 6 times a year as opposed to 3 or 4 times now with your division rival. And these games were nasty. Physical. None of that finesse shit that we see with the Showtime Lakers. And you gotta remember, earlier on in that rivalry, Philly had the edge. Philly had the experience on their side. And not to mention, they had Dr. J, who was still pretty much at his prime when Larry Bird entered the NBA in 1979. Now, with what Larry Bird did, those guys are so interwoven with each other. Sometimes you say Magic when you meet Bird, and sometimes you say Bird when you meet Magic. But when Larry Bird entered the NBA in 1979, yes, he performed a miracle. He turned around a team that had just recently lost John Havlicek. They only won 29 games. He helped to turn that team around by some 32 wins to 61 victories. And they went all the way from not making the playoffs the year prior in 79 to making it to the Eastern Conference Finals in 1980. Though they were just completely outmatched by the Philadelphia 76ers 4-1 in that series. And in that particular series, Larry Bird averaged 22.2 points, 13.8 rebounds, 3.6 assists, 1.6 steals, 1.4 blocks on 44% shooting from the floor, and 37.5% from three-point range. Matter of fact, he connected on 3 3 of 8 from downtown. They didn't shoot a lot of threes back then. And he was 85.7% from the line. This series was before the arrival of Robert Parrish via trade from the Warriors, and before they drafted Kevin McHale. His front court compadre at that time was Cedric Cornbread Maxwell, who in that series averaged 18 points and 9.8 rebounds. Matter of fact, it was Cedric Cornbread Maxwell that won the 81 Finals MVP when Boston won and Larry Bird won their fourth. Larry Bird won his first championship, and Boston won what I believe was their 14th championship at that time. But early on, like I said, Dr. J and the Sixers had the advantage earlier on. It was for a couple of reasons. Number one, experience. Oh, in that series, Julius Erving averaged 25 points, 8.4 rebounds, 4.2 assists, 2.6 steals, 1.4 blocks, 50.5% shooting from the floor, and 77% from the line. He even hit a 3 in that series, Dr. J. The reason why they had the advantage in those earlier years, in my opinion, were experience and the fact that Dr. J posed a problem for Bird. And that is, Bird did have trouble with guys who were athletic. Now, I don't want to contradict myself and say that Bird would get shut down offensively. Some idiot said that in a video. That's not true. Bird would not get shut down offensively by these guys because Bird's game was not predicated on his athleticism. All right, so he would not get shut down offensively by strong athletic forwards. Ask Xavier McDaniel if that's true. What Bird had a problem with was guarding players who had quick first steps and were athletic, and he had problems with them. And early on, Dr. J used to give him serious problems. So that was a matchup that they had trouble with, obviously. So Dr. J had some big games. But I think the biggest problem that Boston had against Philly was that they had no answer for a guy that should have been in the Hall of Fame had it not been for foot injuries that derailed his career. And you know what I'm talking about when I say that. The guy who was nicknamed the Boston Strangler, Andrew Toney. Andrew Toney used to destroy the Boston Celtics once he got it going and once he became a force. Now, in 1980, I don't think he had been drafted yet, but if you look at the 81, now actually in 81, let me see if I can get to that one. Give me 1 second. To just emphasize how great this series used to be between Boston and Philly. There were racial overtones. Let's not get it twisted. Black people who were watching those series, you know, they generally tended to root for Philly, while a lot of white America, getting my politics mixed up in here. A lot of white Americans rooted for Larry Bird and Boston. Now, that's not to say everybody was like that. I'm speaking in generalities here. But just to emphasize how great this series was, Cedric Maxwell, who I just mentioned, said that the toughest matchups that Boston had were not in the NBA Finals. It wasn't against the Houston Rockets. It wasn't against the Lakers. It was against the Philadelphia 76ers. Because the Sixers were known for, even more so than the Lakers, the Sixers were known for their athleticism and quickness. And Boston, not to say they didn't have athletes on the team, but they were known more for, Boston was known more for toughness, grit, and having high IQ basketball play and being good basketball players. You know what I'm saying? And playing the game hard the right way. But man, when you go up against guys who can run a 4.4, a 4.3, can bench press 300 pounds, or, you know, got 38, 41 inch, 43 inch vertical leaps. I mean, that's kind of tough, man. Dude, they got a hang time of 0.8 seconds. I mean, how do you? It's difficult to have to deal with that night in and night out. And then, you know what I'm saying, if Boston's shot's not going in, and they're not giving 100% effort, Philly could go in there and blow you the fuck out. But Philly did have one weakness for a couple of years, and that was at the center position. So it was pivotal as Dave Cowens began to decline as a player. It was pivotal for Red Auerbach to replace him with someone that would, number one, be a matchup problem for other teams, and two, at that time in the NBA, you had to have at least an all-star level center to be competitive in the NBA, and that came with Robert Parrish. So what happened was in 1980, Robert Parrish was, I think, ready to go into his 5th year as the starting center for the Golden State Warriors. And he was a really good player. You know, he was good. Wasn't the best center in the NBA, but he was good. But the Warriors thought that they had struck gold when they drafted a guy named Joe Barry Carroll. Now, Joe Barry Carroll, this is why I always say skill isn't everything. Skills-wise, Joe Barry Carroll was better than Robert Parrish, skills-wise. But the problem with Joe Barry Carroll, especially after a couple of years in the NBA, the problem is he had that Ben Simmons shit in him. He didn't care about the game. He didn't love the game. He liked it, but he didn't love it. He didn't have a passion for it. And Warrior scouts didn't see that. Red Auerbach kind of knew it. He could see it in him. He heard about it. So when they picked Joe Barry Carroll, that made Robert Parrish expendable because they drafted, the Warriors at least, thought they drafted a better center. So Boston was able to finagle Robert Parrish away from the Warriors for nothing, which is something I think they regretted over time. At the same time, they drafted a young player from Minnesota by the name of Kevin McHale. 6'10", arms to the fucking floor, who will become, after a couple of years of polish, the greatest low post player the game has ever seen. So it was the front court that the Sixers had problems with over time themselves, whereas it was Philly's backcourt that often gave Boston problems. And that what made it such a great competitive series. In 1981, the Sixers, as usual at that time at least, were dominating the Celtics initially with a 3-1 series lead. Matter of fact, game 1, Philly won 105-104, even though Larry Bird scored 33 points in that game. Game 2, Boston dominated Philly, winning 118-99. Andrew Toney, despite the blowout, had 35 points in that particular contest. Game 3, Philly won 110-100, taking a 2-1 lead. And then in Game 3, Philly prevailed 107-105, despite Larry Bird's 17 rebounds. But Boston would win the final 3 games 111-109, 198, and 91-90. So these weren't like blowout victories. These were close, gutted out, often the last team with the last possession winning the ball game type games. And it was a reversal of fortune to a certain extent in this particular series as far as efficiency. Whereas Julius Erving was dominating Larry Bird in 1980 in the conference finals for the most part, this series, it was the other way around. Larry Bird in this series averaged nearly 27 points per game, 13 rebounds, 4.6 assists, 2 steals, 1.4 blocks, and 49% shooting from the floor and 89% from the charity stripe. Whereas in this series, Julius Erving only shot 43% from the floor, which was terrible by 1980 standards. That's like shooting in 30s today. And averaging fewer than 20 points per game. Although Andrew Toney averaged 19.1 points per game on 46% shooting. In 1982, they once again met up in the Eastern Conference Finals. And in that particular series, Philly was able to overcome Boston barely 4-3. Andrew Toney had 30 points in a pivotal, and this is why they called him the Boston Strangler. All right? This is why they started calling him the Boston Strangler. Game 1, Boston blew out Philly 121-81. Gotta remember, at this time, Boston was the defending NBA champions. But in Game 2, Philly beat Boston 121-113. Andrew Toney went off for 30 points in this game. Game 3, Philly won 99-97, taking a 2-1 lead. Game 4, Philly wins 119-94. Andrew Toney goes off for 39. 39. Remember, there was no three-point shot back then. Game 5, well, there was a three-point shot. Most guys weren't taking it. Game 5, Boston wins 114-85, narrowed it 3-2. Game 6, Boston wins 88-75, tying the series at 3-3. So then, of course, you have a pivotal Game 7. And I'm trying to remember who the hell had home court advantage, but I want to say it was Boston that had home court advantage. Yeah, they did. They were the number 1 seed. Boston had home court advantage. So the stage is set for Boston to come back from another 3-1 deficit. But Andrew Toney said not this time, as Andrew Toney goes off for 34 points and leads Philly to a 120-106 victory. In this series, Larry Bird did not perform well at all. 18.3 points, did average 14.1 rebounds and 7.3 assists, 2 steals and 1 block, but he only shot 41% from the floor, and for him, a rather anemic 73% from the free throw line, missing 7 out of 26 free throws. Robert Parrish averaged 19 and 11 on 48% shooting. And Kevin McHale, in that particular series, coming off the bench, averaged 16 and 8. And Cedric Cornbread Maxwell averaged 12 and 7. But Andrew Toney in this series led all scorers with 22 points per game on 50% shooting from the floor. It was Andrew Toney that forced Boston to get Dennis Johnson, arguably the greatest defensive point guard the game has ever seen. Arguably. And I know some people will say Gary Payton, and he's definitely up there. I'm not going to argue whether Dennis Johnson's great. I'm not saying that. But they're the 2 greatest defensive guards ever, in my opinion. Dennis Johnson and Gary Payton. But that's why they got him, because of Andrew Toney. And unfortunately, in '82, Philly got Moses Malone. And they ran the tables that year. And matter of fact, in the conference finals in '83, the Sixers played against the Bucks, because the Bucks wound up sweeping the Celtics in the semis. And matter of fact, I think there was no quote unquote opening first round. There was no. It was basically, I think it was 3 rounds in the playoffs at that time. I think after '83, that's when it expanded to how it is today, where there's 4 different rounds, and the opening round was best of 5 until 2001 or 2 or whatever year it was, 3 when they made it best of 7. But that's pretty much it, man. After '83, Philly sort of fell off slowly, started falling off. Still was a pretty good team until about '87. And then afterwards, after the retirement of Julius Erving, they fell off as far as being a championship caliber team. But they really started falling off after '84 and '85. They were still a good team, but you definitely started getting the impression that Boston had taken over the Eastern Conference by then. And these also coincided with Larry Bird's best years. '84, '85, '86, he won back-to-back MVPs. But, yeah, man, that was a big rivalry. Matter of fact, remember, there was a video game that came out. I think it was Dr. J versus Larry Bird. Remember, it was an early Atari/PC game from like '84. So, yeah, there was definitely a rivalry between these two, man. I just want to touch on that for a little bit. But tell me what you guys think.